Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to League Analysis. I'm Handygamer, and today I'll be looking into the draft of the very first semifinal in this year's Worlds, which was the one between an SKT and RNG. I will be making this a multi-video series, such that you can choose how much you want to look into at any given time. You can skip games where you think the draft isn't interesting. And right now, with the very first video, I will actually not be talking about any game in particular, but first take a look at the junglers that are prevalent throughout the entire World Series and how they match up against each other, because from my point of view, that's not just very crucial in understanding the very first semifinal between SKT and RNG, but also in understanding the drafts that took place between Samsung and Team World Elite in the other semifinal. So yeah, let's look at that first. But before I get to that, let me just quickly tell you a bit about myself so you get a certain grasp as to what my level of analysis is and how much understanding I might have. I have been casting the German League of Legends University League run by University Esports Germany for the past year as a color caster. I consider myself more towards the analysis side of things, especially the draft. I think would be one of my strengths, but obviously I'm not part of the professional circuit, so you have to take everything I say with a certain grain of salt because, well, obviously I'm not one of the big dogs, but I just felt like it could be helpful to give my 2 cents on the drafts, because I think some parts, some actually pretty crucial parts, have been overlooked by the narrative, at least, that has been presented during the World's Cast up until now. And I want to focus on those. And in order to do so, let's now finally start with the junglers. The junglers that are available in the current metagame are, if you really break it down to the major ones, a jungle trifecta of Sejuani, Jarvan IV and Gragas. With Sejuani being picked the most often, and Jarvan being the only one that has actually been literally banned or picked in every single game. Sejuani was overlooked in one game, as a matter of fact. Gragas has been picked in 72% of the games, or at least has been banned in the remaining 28%. Obviously, he wasn't the item of choice, so that's also something that we will be looking into later on in the game when we actually, or in analysis, when we will be discussing how these match up. So, how is Gragas doing versus Sejuani? How is Sejuani doing versus Jarvan IV? And how is Gragas doing versus Jarvan? But before we get to that, let's just look at the picks themselves and get a certain understanding as to what they actually do, what their strengths and their weaknesses are. And I want to start up with Sejuani there, because she's been picked the most often. So obviously her strengths have to outweigh her or her contras, her weaknesses. And I think one of her main strengths is her being the tankiest of the three, with her build involving in most cases wallmocks. She has a lot of staying power in the fights, and if she's forced to exit the fight, she might even rejoin at a later stage of the fight again. So given the current metagame with quite a lot of tanks and hyper carries, her ability to soak a lot of damage is actually pretty relevant, especially against champions that build Infinity Edge and thus don't really go for the percentage health damage. And also her engage potential with her ultimate is pretty strong. She also has her Arctic Assault, her Q, that can be combined with Flash to flank, catch enemy carries out of position. And if you look at the other tanks around her, she has a lot of melee synergy with, for example, the Galio in the mid lane or any tanky top laner, because she can use their auto attacks to stack and then finally use her stun on any enemies around her, so she doesn't only have strong engage potential, but strong peeling potential as well. And if she goes for her catches, she doesn't even have to commit that hard, because she can throw out her ultimate, her bolas. And if they whiff, you don't have to follow through. And if you do hit, well, there you go, Flash and Arctic Assault, and the enemy is knocked down. Her weaknesses obviously are that she has a very weak early game. She doesn't have an amazing clear speed or a high clear speed whatsoever compared to the other two that we'll be looking into. So her early game can be abused. And if she's the only frontline your team has to offer, she isn't that great. I would say she's still decent, but you can still just ignore her if you're the AD carry. If you're diving the backline, you have to have Sejuani actually stand right next to you in order to lock down more than one member of your team. And her itemization, her warmocks actually is immensely weakened by the fact that she's the only frontliner, because she cannot really juggle the aggro of your damage. Even if she's soaking all the damage, there is no reason to, or no one else left to focus but the weaker damage threats in your team if she has to exit the fight and use the warmocks to regain health. So if you have only one frontliner, Sejuani's most standard item build is not as effective. So with that in mind, she doesn't have any terrible matchups. For example, against Jarvan and Gragas, she's doing fine. So you can pick her pretty early on in the draft and kind of say, okay, we don't care if you go for the Gragas or go for the Jarvan. Sejuani is fine against either of the two. Then again, she also doesn't have any great matchups. So you won't see her as a reaction to any specific champion trying to counter whatever the champion is trying to achieve during any stage of the game. She won't be able to pressure him early. She won't be really able to disrupt too many combo setups in the later stages of the game. And I think that's why she has only an average performance. I think her overall record is close to 50% win rate, and that's, I think, one of the correct characteristics of a safe default pick. She's been picked the third most out of any champions, and I think ahead of her there's only like Lulu and like Tristana or something. So she's one of the very meta-defining champions right now, and she doesn't have too many downsides, which is why you see her early on in the draft. Now, let's talk about Jarvan. His obvious downside in comparison to Sejuani is that he isn't tanky by himself. Changes to his W, like almost a year ago, made him somewhat viable in terms of diving the backline, because a tanky itemization is now actually incentivized because your shield scales with your tankiness. But what makes him pretty strong in the current metagame is how the hyper carries are actually pretty important in dealing with the tanks, and his ability to lock exactly those hyper carries down with his Cataclysm. There are a lot of synergy picks available that are played in the current meta. You have, for example, the Galio in the mid lane, or you can have several top laners such as the Rumble or the Gnar, or maybe even the Shen, to either follow up upon his Cataclysm or give him additional tankiness so that he can use his high damage output, which he does have, which is another reason why he's good against those hyper carries. He can just try to burst them down by himself. And that's all great. That's all very good. He's a very strong counter to as I said, most AD carries that are being played right now. But his playstyle is very binary. Either he is strong enough to lock down the AD carry and pressure him or her with the Cataclysm, or he is basically useless, because if he's falling behind, he might jump the AD carry, but he won't be feeling too pressured, can simply just stay in the Cataclysm if your team doesn't have any follow-up threat, and the AD carry is strong enough, has, for example, a Lulu or a Janna next to him that help him sustain through the burst of Jarvan, then Jarvan himself will become pretty useless. As soon as you are forced to use your Cataclysm on the enemy front line in order to peel for your team, I think the game is pretty much over for Jarvan in the current meta game. And that's, I think, his major downside, his major weakness. And the number of counter picks that are available to counter his all-in kind of playstyle are actually another reason why I think Jarvan has received more bans than, say, Sejuani, and has, as a result, been played less. However, he still does have his strong early and mid game, so there are still enough reasons to pick him, and especially if your top laner is actually able to play him as a top lane champion, I think you can pick him as a flex pick, but given the fact that I want to be focusing on the junglers themselves, I kind of want to neglect the potential here, because to me it's more about the actual jungler performance than the possibilities that you have in the draft, because I think all of the teams that were left in the semifinals weren't really playing Jarvan as flex pick top laner, so it's not really relevant. Last on the list is Gragas. Contrary to Jarvan and Sejuani, he's doing fine at almost all stages of the game. He has a high enough clear speed in the early game. He can actually duel the Jarvan well enough to not feel too pressured, and he still has decent performance against any given matchup. How they are faring against each other, all the different numbers, will be up on my next slide. So we will actually take a look at what I'm talking about and why I think all the potential matchups make for a very good meta for the Gragas here. However, if you want to use him to his fullest extent, you have to be able to use the Flash Body Slam into Explosive Cast combination, which requires a certain level of mechanical skill. So his combo might actually be hard to pull off. And I think he's also, if you have other frontliners, he is weaker than Sejuani as a frontliner by himself. He doesn't play the Warmox. He's more of a resistance kind of tank. But he is a hard counter to all-in team composition. With his explosive cask, he can simply just knock aside either the front line that is trying to dive and pressure your carries, or the enemy carries that are trying to follow up. For example, if you think of say a Twitch opening up with his spray and pray and his team engaging at the very same time, well, guess what? If you throw an explosive cask between the team and the Twitch, and there isn't enough space between the two that you completely whiff the ability, you will have now created enough distance between Twitch and his team that you can A, go for picking off the Twitch, or B, proceed to clean house with the front line, because now your backline doesn't feel pressured, because the damage of Twitch is not reaching the backline. So, Explosive Cask, great ability, almost the same as Janna's Monsoon, but contrary to the Monsoon, it's not necessarily just around himself. He can use it in a high enough area around himself that he can actually use it for objective control, because he can just deny the enemy jungler from entering, say, the Baron Pit. And he can also use it as a siege tool to, for example, pressure a mid lane outer turret when you want to rush it down, against maybe 2 or 3 defending enemy champions, because you can just toss them aside by another 2-3 seconds, where your AD carry and maybe your mid laner can out attack the turret, and maybe go for an earlier mid lane turret pickup, or later on inhibitor turret pickup, to open the map for your own team. So, as I said, strong points with each of these 3 junglers, weaknesses which either of them. But now let's look at actual numbers. Sejuani, as I mentioned, has been picked 43 times with a roughly 50% record. I wouldn't say that 21 to 22 as an overall performance is anything but 50-50. And most of her matchups are pretty even. For example, if you look at the matchup versus Gragas, it's an 8-8. So yeah, 50% there. Against Jarvan, as I mentioned, she has a weak early game. So Jarvan actually manages to pull ahead, especially in games where his team is just going to snowball from the early lead that he gets through the jungle. He will have more pressure for the lanes, and in case you're snowballing the game and are actually able to close them out, those games, then you will actually end up winning more, would have thought. Jarvan himself mostly benefits in terms of his statistics from his matchup against Sejuani. Aside from the Sejuani matchup, he's only been able to pull ahead in 5 of the games where he has been picked as a jungler. As I mentioned, there are 5 games where he's been played as a top laner with an 80% win record there. But in terms of jungle, if you neglect the Sejuani, which is, again, the main go-to pick right now, he hasn't been doing so great. And the major reason why he hasn't been doing so great is sitting at the opposite side of my chart, and that's Gragas. Prior to the semifinals, Gragas' head-to-head record against Jarvan IV was a 100% win record in 5 games, which, given the fact that both were picked rather frequently, I would say indicates one of 2 things. A, either Gragas is a very strong pick against Jarvan by himself, or the team combinations that have been built around these 2 hugely favor Gragas' team composition. I actually went back and checked most of the games that, or at least the statistics of most of the games at the drafts where Gragas was matched against Jarvan prior to the semifinals, and there wasn't a clear-cut trend that, say, Gragas was picked together with hyper carries and used as a healing tool per se. So his explosive cask by itself wasn't the major reason why he's been doing so well against Jarvan, and Jarvan wasn't always going for all-in kind of team compositions. So I think the main reason why Gragas has been performing so well is that his kit simply hard counters whatever Jarvan is trying to do. Of course, there's a third option that the sample size is simply too small, that 5 games out of the roughly 70 games played prior to the semifinal are just not a high enough number of games to actually rate the head-to-head between these 2. But I think looking at the results, or at the outcome from the semifinals, where Gragas and Jarvan have been picked 4 out of 9 games against each other, and Gragas winning each and every single one of those, still, it's a small sample size. It's only 4 games in absolute terms, but no matter how small your sample size is, if you increase the sample size by almost 100%, in this case you increase the sample size by 80%, and the result doesn't change, I would say it's a strong indication that the sample size itself isn't the key issue here. I would argue that indeed Gragas' kit is why he's working so well against Jarvan. He can use his body slam reliably, it doesn't have a huge wind-up time, it has a pretty high enough travel speed to interrupt the flag and drag combination of Jarvan IV. He can use the explosive cask to counteract the Cataclysm, the all-in potential. He isn't really open or prone to being punished through early invades from the Jarvan. And If you look at Gragas' numbers, you can see that he's doing pretty well overall. So he's even if you discount the 9 wins against Jarvan, he still has a 14 and 10 record. So he's still a very strong pick by itself. So yeah, Gragas. From my point of view, from my perspective, no matter which jungler you actually let these two play against each other, they should always have, in the later stages of the game, a huge favor for the Gragas. Simply in terms of what he can do in the team fight compared to the Jarvan. Again, Jarvan has a binary playstyle. The binary playstyle is hard countered by Gragas, so I don't know. I don't see any point in picking the Jarvan against the Gragas. But now let's take a look at why Jarvan hasn't been picked more often. Because, as I mentioned, if you neglect the matchup against Jarvan IV, he's been doing pretty well. He's been sitting at 14 and 10 overall, but he's only been picked 72 or banned 72% of the time. So why is that? Why aren't people picking up on Gragas more often? I think the key reason is his record against Sejuani. He's not like stomping the matchup or whatever in a sense that he's stomping the matchup versus Jarvan, because he's not hard countering Sejuani's kit. Sejuani can simply go for picks, lock down the carries, have your team deal damage to them from a distance, and your explosive cask won't make too much of a difference. He also can't really punish her by catching her out of position. Jarvan IV isn't tanky enough that he can survive being comboed by Gragas and knocked into his entire team if his team isn't ready to follow up. Sejuani is rather tanky. She will survive an additional couple of seconds, and if she manages to get out, she will still be able to contribute to the teamfight later on because of her Warmogs. So I think in terms of skill set that these two champions have, and in terms of what they actually want to do during the teamfight, Gragas and Sejuani is more of an even matchup. That's why we don't see more of the Gragas, especially if you take a look at the number of losses he has received. 8 of his 10 losses were against Sejuani. So yeah, I think he's a very strong pick if you ban the Sejuani. But as long as Sejuani is left open and is left available as the comfort pick for, I think, most junglers in this tournament, Gragas will simply not outclass her enough to warrant going for him instead of the Jarvan. That's it for my first video about the draft phase in the semifinals of Worlds. Thanks for watching up until this point. If you're still interested, I'll be uploading additional videos where I'll be discussing the draft of the games themselves. So make sure to check them out. I'm gonna try to make a playlist so that you can just follow along if you're interested. And if you're interested, just leave a comment if you want to discuss certain points within my video. I know that my English isn't perfect, as I kind of hinted at. I'm a German native. English isn't my mother tongue, so well, you might criticize my accent, my pronunciation, my choice of words, but I think it would be better suited or more fitting to actually focus on the content, on what I was trying to discuss here, instead of blaming me for my choice. Anyways, as I said, thanks for watching, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you kind of liked the video.